There are moments in life when we find ourselves walking a path that seems empty, where silence replaces conversation and solitude takes the place of companionship. In those moments, it's easy to feel abandoned, to wonder if anyone sees you, if anyone hears your prayers. But let me tell you today, being alone is not a sign that you are forgotten. No, my friend, being alone is where God speaks the loudest. Think of Moses standing alone on the mountain, staring into the flames of the burning bush, hearing the voice of God for the first time. No one else was there, no crowd, no distractions, just a man and the divine presence calling him into purpose. Or Elijah trembling in a cave, thinking he was the last believer left, feeling the weight of isolation pressing down on him, and yet it was there in the stillness, in the quiet, that he heard the whisper of God. God speaks in many ways, but often he chooses solitude to reveal his deepest truths. When the noise of the world fades away, when we are no longer surrounded by opinions and pressures, that is when our hearts become truly open to hearing his voice. Many times we pray for answers, we ask for direction, but we are too distracted to hear when God is speaking. It is not until he removes us from the crowd, sets us apart, and quiets everything around us that we finally recognize his voice. Jesus himself understood this. Even as the Son of God, he constantly withdrew to be alone, to seek the Father's presence, to listen, to prepare for what was ahead. Before he chose his disciples, he spent the night alone in prayer. Before his greatest trials, he found solitude. Even before going to the cross in the Garden of Gethsemane, he stood alone before the Father, surrendering his will. So if you find yourself in a season of solitude, do not despair. God is not punishing you. He is positioning you. He is setting you apart to speak to you, to strengthen you, to show you something you could not see when you were surrounded by distractions. It is in the quiet that he prepares you for something greater. Jesus himself understood the power of solitude, the Son of God who was constantly surrounded by people, by crowds pressing in on him, by disciples who walked with him daily. He still sought time alone. He knew that the source of his strength, his wisdom, and his clarity came from those moments when he stepped away from the noise, away from the demands, and into the presence of the Father. Time and time again, Scripture tells us that Jesus withdrew to pray, to seek, to prepare. Think about it. Before he began his ministry, he spent 40 days alone in the wilderness. The enemy tried to tempt him, to break him, but in that solitude, Jesus found strength, not weakness. Before he chose his disciples, he spent an entire night alone in prayer. Before performing miracles, before walking on water, before facing the cross, he took time to be alone with God. Why? Because he knew that solitude is not isolation, it is preparation. Many people fear being alone. They associate it with weakness, with rejection, with something being wrong in their lives. But what if God is using that solitude to shape you, to strengthen you, to give you clarity for the next step? What if this season of being alone is not about what you lack, but about what you are gaining? Jesus did not withdraw because he was weak. He withdrew because he understood that in the quiet, in the stillness, God speaks, God prepares, and God empowers. If Jesus, the Son of God, needed solitude to fulfill his mission, how much more do we? If he sought time alone with the Father before facing his greatest challenges, how much more should we? Do not despise the moments when you are set apart. Do not fear the seasons when you feel alone. Because in those moments you are not abandoned, you are being prepared. The world teaches us to fear being alone. Society tells us that success is measured by how many friends we have, how connected we are, how busy and occupied our lives appear. We are constantly bombarded with noise, social media, television, notifications, conversations, expectations, and yet in all this noise, people still feel empty. They still feel lost. Why? Because the human soul was not created to be constantly surrounded by distraction. It was created for something deeper. There is a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the absence of people, but solitude is the presence of God. Some of the greatest figures in history were shaped in seasons of solitude. Look at David, a young shepherd boy left alone in the fields with nothing but his harp and his sheep. No crowds, no applause, no recognition. Just him and God. And in that solitude, God was preparing a king. Joseph spent years in isolation, separated from his family, forgotten in prison, but in that solitude, God was positioning him for greatness. Paul, before he became the mighty apostle who spread the gospel to the world, spent 3 years in the wilderness. Why? Because before God uses you publicly, he prepares you. You see, solitude is not a curse, it is a gift. It is a season where you are free from distractions, free from outside voices, free from the opinions of others, so you can hear the only voice that truly matters, God's voice. And when you listen, when you lean into that silence, you will find that being alone is not emptiness, it is empowerment. It is in these moments that God molds you, strengthens you, and reveals his plans for your life. When you stop resisting solitude and start embracing it, you will discover that God is not keeping you away from something. He is drawing you closer to him. The greatest transformations in life often happen in the quiet, unseen places. When a seed is planted, it does not immediately sprout into a towering tree. No, it spends time buried beneath the soil, hidden away, taking root in the darkness where no one can see. But that season of solitude is not wasted, it is necessary. Without it, the seed would never grow strong enough to stand. And just like that seed, sometimes God places us in seasons of solitude to root us deeply in his purpose before revealing us to the world. Many people resist being alone because they equate it with being forgotten. They feel like they are standing still while the rest of the world is moving forward. But the truth is, when God calls you to a season of separation, he is not delaying you, he is doing something in you that could not be done in the midst of distractions. He is strengthening your faith, sharpening your vision, refining your heart. Think about Jesus in the wilderness. He was led there by the Spirit not to be punished, but to be prepared. The enemy came at him with temptations, with lies, with every trick in the book. But because Jesus had spent time in solitude, because he had been alone with the Father, he stood firm. He did not waver. And when he left that wilderness, maybe you are in a season where it feels like doors are closing, like friendships are fading, like you are standing in a place of silence, wondering what comes next. But hear this, your solitude is not your setback, it is your setup. God is preparing you for something greater, something beyond what you can see right now. And when the time is right, when you have been strengthened, refined, and prepared, you will emerge from this season not weaker, but stronger, not empty, but full of purpose. There is a hidden strength in being alone that most people never realize because they are too busy running from it. They fill their time with distractions, surround themselves with noise, and seek validation from the outside world, fearing what they might find in the silence. But those who embrace solitude, those who lean into the quiet rather than escape from it, discover something powerful. They are never truly alone. God does his greatest work in the stillness. It was in the stillness that Moses heard God's voice through the burning bush. a voice that would call him to lead a nation. It was in the stillness that Elijah, tired and weary, heard the whisper of God, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in a gentle whisper that restored his soul. And it is in the stillness of your own life that God is speaking to you now, shaping you, preparing you for something beyond what you can imagine. When you embrace solitude, you realize that your strength does not come from people, from titles, from achievements. It comes from God alone. And when you no longer depend on the world to define you, you become unstoppable. You walk differently, you speak differently, you live with a quiet confidence that cannot be shaken, because you know that whether the world praises you or forgets you, whether you're surrounded by people or standing on your own, you are never abandoned. You are never overlooked. You are being refined, strengthened, and positioned for something greater. So do not fear being alone. Do not resist the quiet seasons of life. Instead, embrace them, knowing that in the stillness, God is doing something powerful within you. He is making you stronger, wiser, and more prepared than ever before. And when the time comes when he calls you forward, you will not step out uncertain or unprepared. You will step out in power, fully equipped for what is ahead. When you embrace being alone, you begin to see the world differently. You stop seeking approval from others and start walking in the confidence that comes from knowing who you are in God. You no longer feel the need to explain yourself, to prove yourself, to fit into the molds that others have created for you. Instead, you move with a quiet assurance, knowing that your value is not determined by who stands beside you, but by the one who created you. Solitude has a way of stripping away the unnecessary, of removing distractions so you can focus on what truly matters. In the silence, you begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly. You start to recognize the habits, the beliefs, the patterns that have been holding you back. And most importantly, you begin to hear God's voice. Look at the lives of those who have made a lasting impact. People who changed the course of history, who walked in purpose and power. They all had something in common. They spent time in solitude. They were not afraid to be alone, to go against the grain, to separate themselves from the crowd. They understood that greatness is birthed in the quiet places, in the moments when no one is watching, in the seasons where it feels like nothing is happening. But in reality, everything is happening. God is working, he is molding, refining, and preparing. And when you come out of that season, you will walk differently. You will no longer rely on the approval of others because you have found something greater, the approval of God. You will not fear being alone because you have discovered that solitude is not a weakness but a weapon. It is the place where you grow, where you gain wisdom, where you become the person God intended you to be. And when the time is right, you will step forward, not as someone who has been left behind, but as someone who has been set apart, ready to walk in the fullness of your calling. So now, as you stand in this moment, wherever you are, I want you to hear this truth. You are not alone. Even in the silence, even in the seasons where it feels like no one sees you, God sees you. He is working, shaping, refining you for something greater than you can imagine. This is not the end of your story. It is the preparation for the next chapter. Do not fear solitude. Do not run from it. Embrace it. Let it be the place where you grow, where you gain wisdom, where you deepen your faith. Let it be the space where you learn to stand strong, not because of the world's approval, but because of the unshakable foundation you have in God. And when the time comes, when he calls you forward, you will not step out timid or uncertain. You will step out in power. You will walk with confidence, with clarity, with purpose. because you will know that your strength was never in the crowd, never in the noise, never in the opinions of others. It was always in God. So trust the process, trust the solitude, and trust that God is preparing you for something greater than you have ever known.